Have you ever stared at a painting so horrifying that you felt as though you had stumbled into the mind of madness itself? A painting so raw, so unflinching, that even 200 years later, it still feels like a nightmare brought to life. In the early 19th century, Spain's most celebrated painter locked himself inside his house and covered its walls with images that no one was ever meant to see. Among them was a monstrous vision that would go on to terrify the world, Saturn Devouring His Son by Francisco Goya. Tonight, we're not just going to look at it, we're going to ask why Goya painted something so grotesque, what it reveals about his own crumbling mind, and what hidden truths it forces us to face about power, mortality, and the darkest corners of human nature. Before we descend into this abyss, let's set the scene. Francisco Goya was Spain's most important painter of his era. He rose from humble beginnings to become court painter to the Spanish crown, documenting kings, queens, and aristocrats with dazzling skill. But beneath the splendor of royal portraiture, Goya harbored a restless spirit. He lived through one of Spain's bloodiest centuries: wars with France, the brutal Peninsular War, the rise and fall of monarchs, the terror of the Inquisition. By the time he reached his later years, he had witnessed more violence, corruption, and despair than most could bear. And then came his own personal tragedy. Goya lost his hearing in his 40s, plunging him into a world of silence and isolation. This silence, some historians argue, became the echo chamber of his imagination. By the time he reached his 70s, Goya was almost completely withdrawn, plagued by illness, paranoia, and despair. It was during this period, between 1819 and 1823, that he created the infamous Black Paintings, 14 nightmarish murals painted directly onto the walls of his home, known as the Quinta del Sordo, the House of the Deaf Man. And perhaps the most infamous of them all is the one we're looking at tonight, Saturn Devouring His Son. At first glance, the painting is almost unbearable. A towering figure, wild-eyed, emerges from the shadows. His mouth is clamped around the mutilated body of a young man, his own son. The boy's head is already gone, his body torn, his arm hanging limp as Saturn gnashes and swallows. The giant's hands are claw-like, almost animalistic, gripping the corpse with a feral hunger. His eyes, bloodshot, bulging, glare outward, as though he knows he's being watched, but cannot stop himself. This is not mythology as you know it. In the original Roman myth, Saturn, or Cronus in Greek mythology, devoured his children because he feared a prophecy that one of them would overthrow him. In classical art, painters like Rubens depicted the scene with a certain grandeur, Cronus devouring an infant in a way that still retained mythological distance, but Goya's version abandons all grandeur. This is not a god, it's a monster. It's not the triumph of myth, it's a glimpse into cannibalistic madness. Even more disturbing is what Goya leaves out. Saturn is usually shown with all his children, or with his wife, or in a cosmic setting. Here there's nothing, no background, no context, only blackness. Saturn himself is not a noble titan, but a hunched, filthy, almost skeletal figure, crouched in the dark like a beast. His victim is not a tiny child, but a grown adult male, almost as large as Saturn himself, making the act even more grotesque, as though this god has turned into a desperate animal, tearing flesh with no end in sight. But what was Goya really painting? Scholars have debated this for decades, and the truth is layered, unsettling, and still unresolved. On the surface, yes, this is Saturn devouring his child. But some argue it's not myth at all. It is Goya himself, devouring his own legacy. Goya, the court painter, who once flattered kings and nobles, is now alone in his house, consumed by bitterness at the corruption of power, the endless cycle of violence he has witnessed in Spain, and his own encroaching mortality. Saturn's desperate act, eating his own children out of fear, may be a mirror of Goya's despair, watching his country consume itself in endless wars and tyranny. Others see it as deeply personal. Goya had lost many children in infancy. Only one of his sons survived into adulthood. Could the painting be a nightmarish projection of his own grief and guilt? The father who loses his children now imagines himself as the father who devours them. And then there's the psychological angle. Painted in his secluded house with no audience in mind, Saturn might have been Goya's private exorcism of madness itself. We know he suffered from what today might be diagnosed as depression, paranoia, even psychosis. In the silence of his deafness, surrounded by his own thoughts, he may have painted not mythology, not politics, but his own fear of losing his mind. What makes this painting even more haunting is how it was discovered. Goya never titled it. In fact, he never wrote about it, never exhibited it, never intended it to be seen. It was simply one of 14 black paintings that covered the walls of his house. After his death, the house changed hands, and in the 1870s, the paintings were painstakingly transferred from plaster to canvas. That's when the world finally saw them and recoiled. Can you imagine walking into an abandoned house and peeling back the walls only to find this staring back at you? The black paintings as a whole form one of the most chilling collections in Western art. They include processions of the insane, duels to the death, witches' sabbaths, and grotesque figures muttering in the dark. But among them, Saturn stands out because it captures not just madness, but a universal, timeless terror. The fear of being consumed by the very forces that gave you life. Let's step back for a moment. Saturn devouring his son doesn't just belong to mythology or psychology. It belongs to a long tradition of art confronting mortality and violence. In the medieval period, artists painted the dance of death, reminding viewers that the grave spares no one. In the Renaissance, Michelangelo's Last Judgment filled the Sistine Chapel with twisted bodies falling into hell. Caravaggio in the Baroque shocked viewers with unflinching realism of severed heads and martyrdom. But Goya went even further. He stripped away all context, all distance, leaving only the act itself. He forces us to look directly into the horror with no filter. And that's why this painting still unsettles us today. Because deep down, it's not really about Saturn at all. It's about us, about the cycles of history where power consumes the powerless, about parents who destroy their children's futures out of fear or ignorance, about societies that devour themselves from within, and about the inevitability of death, looming, inescapable, devouring all of us in time. So I'll ask you, when you look into the bulging eyes of Goya's Saturn, what do you see? Do you see a mythological god punished by fate? Do you see a reflection of Goya himself, consumed by his demons? Or do you see a warning that still applies today? That power, unchecked, will always devour its own. Tell me in the comments what you think, because maybe the true horror of Saturn devouring his son is not that Goya painted it in the darkness of his home, but that its truth still follows us in the darkness of our world.